All right, my name is Scott Jameson, and how many of you want to get the most out of SharePoint? How many of you want to get the least out of SharePoint? All right, this session is not for that guy. Typically, the best way to get the most out of SharePoint is to put something in place that users want and they like to use, and you maximize your adoption, right? And that's kind of how we measure it. So this is not necessarily an adoption session per se, but the things we're going to talk about maximize our ability to gain adoption properly, right? And we're going to do that in a couple of ways. So real quick, I'm the author, or co-author, excuse me, with Chris Portlick and Sue Hanley of this purple book. How many of you want a copy of this purple book? I have one to give away, so you'll have to fight. We're going to do a death match, actually, is what we're going to do. So at some point in the session, I'll give that away. We're also doing a book signing at 1 that will give away a few more. I think not that many, but you know, we'll get there. Anyway, that's enough about me. So there's really 3 key things we want to do, right? We want to provide clear guidance to users. We want to make sure people understand what they're supposed to do. You know, what should they do? What must they do, right? These are kind of governance-y kind of things. But we want to make it easy when we want them to do these things. And the way you make it easy is you want them to understand why they're doing something and in what manner or how they should be doing it, right? And the final principle that I try to follow is the KISS principle, which is just to keep it simple, right? Let's not get too crazy here. And the thing I see about SharePoint is that people either follow the none or the insane strategy, right? None is, oh, okay, Office 365, sure. Oh, out of the box, sure, done. All right, we're deployed. Hey, wow, that took 8 minutes. I can go to lunch now, right? Or go gangbusters and do, analysis paralysis, and we're, 10 years down the road, and we probably don't want to do that either because we don't want to make it so complex that people don't understand what they're trying to accomplish. So let's pick something in particular that's going to help us organize our content, right? And that's information architecture, and that's what we're going to focus most of the session on, is information architecture, but backed by proper governance, okay? So that's going to help us out. So when we talk about information architecture, the first thing when I talk to SharePoint folks, they think of web pages and sites and metadata columns and libraries and all these different parts of SharePoint. And those are all important things, right? They're building blocks of how you construct an information architecture in SharePoint. But we're almost moving a little too fast, right? Let's pump the brakes and back up a little bit, because when we want to achieve success through employing information architecture, right, and best practices around that, it's almost like we want to build a grocery store or a library or something that has a physical structure where we put stuff on it and we organize that stuff in such a way that it's easy for people to find, right? We have a little shop. We want to organize stuff so it makes sense on the shelves, right? When you think about that, you're not thinking about shelving and, let's see, how high can we make the shelf, and, how many shelves do we need to buy? Like, that's interesting, but the shelf itself is not the important part. It's how we go about arranging the shelving. So I want to first talk about our approach to information architecture, and then we'll talk about maybe what in SharePoint enables us to construct these things, right? And what limitations, let's say, SharePoint imposes upon us. So what is information architecture? Well, if you ask 10 different people, you'll probably get 10 different answers. Really simply, it's the art and the science of organizing content, right? So all we want to do is take a bunch of stuff and make it easier to find, right? We're not talking about the branding. We're not talking about usability really, except in the context of finding information. So we're kind of keeping it tight here. We're really focusing on the content itself and how we go about getting it after we put it somewhere. And then, people throw around taxonomy as an interesting word that's related to information architecture. And a taxonomy, more specifically, is a specific system of classification. So the sort of classical one is the, biological taxonomy, which is pretty much where the root of this came from, around, is something a plant or an animal, et cetera, right? And then there's some things like a platypus that doesn't fall neatly in there, so you have to make exceptions. But as long as you have some kind of categorization mechanism, it makes it much easier to find your stuff later, right? So we want to focus on a good way to organize things. So in SharePoint, what are our things? Well, forget SharePoint for a second. Who wants to forget about SharePoint temporarily? I do, right? Maybe even more than temporarily. Let's talk about silverware. Does anybody use silverware in the audience? All right, so everybody else eats with their hands, apparently. All right, so when I talk to people about why they want to organize content properly in SharePoint, and they kind of go, that sounds too difficult and whatever. So I say, well, at home, when you unload the dishwasher, do you just take the forks and sort of like throw them in a random drawer, right? Or like a random cabinet, or maybe just throw them on the floor? Well, I mean, typically that's how people use documents, right? They just go, I'll just leave it on the desktop. Or I guess I'll upload it to SharePoint in this big library, whatever, right? Somebody will find it later. I'm not worried about it. The funny thing is, you're super lazy at work, but you're actually pretty efficient at home. You probably have something like this, right? Like something reasonably organized where you put the forks in one slot and the spoons in another. So you went through the trouble, maybe not all of you, some of you, to organize this. You probably actually, moved into a new house and actually picked a drawer strategically. Where's near the sink, but not too close? And you actually gave it some thought. And this is the kind of thought we want to give SharePoint as well. So what is SharePoint at the end of the day? It's a lot of things, right? It's a platform, it's a dessert topping, all that. But it's actually primarily a content management system. So putting our content in SharePoint in an efficient and organized way is what we want to do, right? And then getting it out later. And in SharePoint, there's two key types of content, right? There's web content. This is what we think of when we think of the classic intranet. So publishing pages. You usually think of things like, okay, we need to put together a sitemap and page layouts, and people are going to upload articles and forms and all these things for information retrieval later, right? We want to publish this content out and make it easy to find. And then the second type of content in SharePoint that's pretty common is document content. And what's interesting about both of these types of content is you actually approach them similarly, but then kind of implement them differently within SharePoint. I'll go into what that means. So in document content, you use resources like document libraries and metadata, and we'll go into this a little bit more. So when you approach your IA, what I want you to do is I want you to break it down into 4 key steps. Now, other folks will have you break it down into 2 steps or 8 steps or whatever. These are my 4. Take it or leave it. The idea is you want to define what you want to do first, right? You want to make sure you understand what is your goal. What are you actually trying to accomplish? And then you start designing what you want to do, right? So make sure you have your goal first, and then start designing, and then implement. So notice I didn't say implement first. Just pay attention. And then govern, which is a really important one. And govern's important because you can put all the nice systems in place, but if people don't follow those rules, then your system's going to go to heck, right? And that's no fun. So let's actually put our process to the test with silverware first. Let's use that because, well, with the exception of some of you, most of us use some kind of silverware. So the first step is define what we're trying to do. So what's our goal? Well, with respect to silverware, we want to be able to find a fork when we need one. Now, again, seems trivially obvious, right? But defining our goal makes it very clear to us what we're trying to do. And we're doing this implicitly in our day-to-day lives. With some things, we're doing it less sort of thoroughly than others. But here, we're probably doing it pretty consistently, reasonably consistently. So when we design our process, we're going to say, OK, in what manner do I want to accomplish this? So I'm going to say, all right, fine. I'll pick a drawer in my kitchen. I'll buy one of those compartmentally things, or maybe I'll make one. Who knows? I'm only in design right now. I'm not deciding how I'm going to implement it yet, right? And I'm going to separate it into compartments. And then implementing it is building it, right? And so, I went to Target or whatever I went to, and I got one of those divider thingies, and I picked slots. And then finally, the govern is all the one we do, but we don't realize we're doing it. For example, I got to train my 3-year-old where the forks live, so that they know where to get a spoon or a fork, right? And then where to put them back when they're clean. And what do? Well, maybe I reward them through little smiley faces, or I reprimand them and saying, Mr. Husband guy, stop putting it in the wrong place, or whatever, right? Unload the dishwasher. And that's actually your informal governance process at home. You're enforcing this, maybe not even through strict rules, but you're setting example, right? And everybody knows after time where to get that stuff. And so it's actually not that hard once you follow these rules within SharePoint. So, for example, if we're doing this with your corporate content, we might look and say, what am I trying to do, right? So in the context of SharePoint, I might want to say, you know, we want to enable people to find stuff, forms or something like that. Or we want to educate employees on policies, and we want them to be able to find those. We want them to, you know, find news and be able to stay relevant. Or we want to find the right document and do that easily, right? So we want to make sure it's clear what we're trying to accomplish. Just saying, well, I want an intranet, or, you know, the business seems to want SharePoint. The problem is it's too vague. It doesn't actually define or clarify what you're trying to accomplish. And then how do you know you're successful unless you have a goal in mind, right? Let's get a goal. So then once you get the goal in mind, you can do things like use card sorting. So what's card sorting? Well, a good example might be taking, one of the things I like to do, card sorting is, you know, you take index cards, you put a bunch of topics on it, or pieces of content actually, and people divide it into categories, right? There's a couple of different ways to do that. You could do it without pre-sorting it, with a little pre-sorting. You take different types of content. One of the things I like to do to warm people up is take old like VHS tapes and throw them into a pile and say, okay, organize those. And some people organize them into genre, like horror movies, comedy, whatever. Some people organize them into kids movies versus adult movies. Some people organize them into who the director was of that movie, right? And the idea is what you want to find out is how are those people thinking about your content that you're going to put into your production SharePoint environment. And by using the movie analogy, people get it, and it's a good warm-up exercise, and then you do it in the context of your production information, right? And then you move on to additional design things like defining a sitemap and a page layout, right? A sitemap is, you know, how I'm going to navigate all this stuff. And a page layout is how am I going to organize things on a given page. And then how am I going to navigate through the entire site. Maybe I have tagging and folder policies, and we'll get into this a little bit more. And then when we implement it, you're going to do things like use out-of-the-box components, create some custom CSS, let's say, if you want to move things around a little bit, behave a certain way, and then maybe additional assets like folders and other content. And we'll get into that more, like I said. And then the governance part is really important because after you implement the system, you want to reinforce it, right? So you want to make sure you're providing guidance, you're doing trainings, and things like that, right? You hold people accountable to making sure this thing sticks. All right, so let's jump into more detail around some of this stuff. So let's take web content first. All right, so web content. Before we go into web content in detail, let's take an information architecture concept here, which is the difference between where I put things versus how things are labeled. And the reason this is interesting is that, you know, on a web page, for example, and by the way, this is Duke Energy, which is a SharePoint site, and it was one of the Nielsen SharePoint Intranets of the Year a couple of years ago, so I just picked that as an example. But there's a couple of different factors, right? Where does the content live physically? And when I say physically, on which page, or more specifically in SharePoint, in which site or site collection or library does this content live? Another one is how the content is labeled in and of itself. So if I have an article page, let's say it's a news item, I could have labeling on that. So the title of the article, the author, the published date, all this information, right? And we typically call that metadata. And then there's how the content can be accessed. So this is maybe I have a link on the home page to that article, but then I might also have a link to that article on a different page of recent news. I may even have that article linked in 5 different places, and that's okay because that's a navigation mechanism. I might even have it in a menu item, right, on the menu. And the idea is that's a way to get to the content that is separate and distinct from where it's actually stored. So let me give you a real-life example of this, which is this is the soup aisle, right? This is where we find our soup, let's say. Well, content lives, or in this case, soup, right, in that aisle physically, right? In contrast, there's a label on the soup. So if we know where the soup lives, why do we need a label at all, right? Well, it seems obvious to us But if we have a bunch of cans on the, even though, let's say we go to the right document library, for example, and it has the right content in it, but we don't know anything more about it, it's actually still really hard to find. It's almost like a soup can without a label on the shelf, right? You're in the right aisle, you went to the soup aisle, it said that on the sign, but you still don't know what you have. So what do you have to do? You have to open every soup can to see what's in it, and that's just not practical. So we still want to make sure we're labeling individual items. And then if we take the flip side, right, which is, okay, we're going to create a great label. We've got nutrition information in our example. In SharePoint, we probably have other metadata. But if we have labels, why do we care about the physical location? Well, imagine a grocery store where everything's labeled, every can, package, everything, but everything's just in a big pile. There's no aisles, right? That's not practical either. So you want a combination of both labeling individual content and having a smart place where it lives. So that combination is, a logical container and or location where it lives physically. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, where if you have, for example, a physical store, like let's say we created a grocery store that was the size of this room, we could hold a finite number of items, and we would probably pick physical locations where those items would live to make it practical for us to go find them, right? But if we're Amazon or something like that, we're not constrained to those physical boundaries. We can actually abstract out that physical location and make it 100% virtual, and then we're detached. Now in SharePoint, we can sort of go somewhere in the middle, right? We don't have the luxury of an infinite container system. We have essentially site collections. And site collections have boundaries that I'll talk about a little bit more. So with regard to the location of storage, with respect to our information architecture, we need to actually pick something. And that's where information architecture and logical design sort of start to intersect a little bit, because we're imposing constraints on our design. All right, so with good navigation, we can get to our physical location of that content. With proper labeling, we can actually review the item, and we can do things like, in SharePoint, for example, search for content, as an example, or filter or sort. And then finally, if we have access methods where we can use virtual technology, right, through menuing and redirection and hyperlinking and all these things, we actually have the advantage of eliminating the need for some physical location. But again, in SharePoint, we have physical constraints that we have to work in. All right, so here's an interesting example that Netflix presented to me today, actually, this morning, because I have nothing better to do than just watch movies all day. So ask these guys in the second row here, right, Randy? So one of the interesting things about this is actually the Netflix website when you're logged in. And one of the things Netflix does is they don't have the physical constraint that we might have in SharePoint, where we care to some extent, not the full extent, but where things are physically stored. What instead they're doing are, Netflix is organizing the content, in this case, movies and TV shows, et cetera, by certain classification attributes, right? One might be, like I said before, director, kids' movies or not, et cetera. In this case, it's organizing it by what's popular, what's trending, and what it picked for me, which are not mutually exclusive lists and somewhat overlapping, right? But not necessarily 100% overlapping. They overlap a little bit. But what's interesting is that you'll notice that Netflix actually enables me to view these lists independently. So for example, the same thing, this Chef's Table, which is, I guess, a Netflix original series, actually shows up in all three recommendations. And the idea here is that when we want to provide navigation and an easy way to get to the content that we're storing in our site, we don't only have to consider where the thing is stored, for example, in what site or in what document library. We want to better consider in what context is that user living, and then get that user to the content they need in that context. So if I'm thinking in terms of, what does Netflix recommend for me, then I'm going to focus on that bottom row, and I'm going to ask for that piece of content, and I don't really care where it is, right? I just want it pulled forward for my benefit. And that's how we want to start thinking about our publishing content with respect to SharePoint. So then what about site architecture? Well, there's some key things around site architecture that's really important, and other factors that go into publishing content. So for example, site architecture in SharePoint would be the physical structure of the portal, right? And this is analogous to the entire layout of the grocery store that we're putting together. The next one is the page architecture itself. So when I land on a page, how am I organizing that page? And in SharePoint, it's more specifically controls and web parts. And how are we organizing it and arranging that content? So if you look at a specific aisle in a grocery store, this is analogous to that page architecture, or maybe an end cap, right? But the page architecture is a better analogy because you've narrowed it down to soup or cereal or whatever in the context of the overall intranet or our grocery store. And now we're actually saying, okay, how do we get you to focus on and get to that piece of information quickly? And organizing that shelf or that page is important in terms of what the user expects to see, and it's well laid out and it's predictable. And then there's the navigation taxonomy, which is how you enable folks to wander throughout your site, right? So how do people get to where they need to go? Because if you're storing physical content in SharePoint, for example, in a library or on a given article page within a given site collection, for example, how do you let people navigate to that page in a predictable manner? So do you use top navigation, a mega menu, right, which is a multi-level nav all in one, side nav, which is immediate? Do you use other techniques? Do you use some of the other Office features like Delve, for example? And then navigation taxonomy in a store might simply be the signage on the end of every aisle, right? So you can shortcut to an aisle if you're in the main aisle. So think of the main aisle as almost like your home page, where you can go down and actually see the larger context and then cut into a specific page, which is, let's say, the Campbell's soup versus the Progresso soup. And then you have your search taxonomy, and this is an interesting one because what this allows you to do is something you can't really physically do in a store per se, right? Which is jump directly to content. So imagine I had an index at the front of the store, and some stores actually have this, where I could do a reverse lookup. So instead of walking down the aisles and being like, soup, no, so, oh yeah, here's soup, and I go down the aisle, right? I could actually pick it up and look up soup, and it says aisle 7, and I haven't even had to go anywhere. I haven't had to explore it all. But then now I need some kind of teleporter, right, to get me to aisle 7 instead of just walking, right? So I still have the physical limitation in the real world, but in SharePoint, for example, I can jump to a specific piece of content via search, and that's the analogy you want to think about when designing your website, that you want to make sure that experience is familiar to people enough that they can navigate to what they need to get to. Now, there's another side to this, by the way, which is there's two parts to this. There's the optimizing the site for the people who go find the content, and then there's optimization for the people who maintain the content. So imagine that you're not the grocery store, you're not looking for soup, but you're stocking the shelves with soup. You probably have a different mindset around how you go about doing that. And I'll talk a little bit more about the consumer experience versus the contributor experience within SharePoint. So when you're developing your site architecture, you want to think about separating content into major groups, things like news versus reference info, product categories, business roles, things like that, right? How do you chop up the content? And something like a card sorting exercise is useful. And then a sitemap is useful because it actually allows you to illustrate how the site's going to be organized physically as well, right? And you've probably seen sitemaps in the past before. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. Now, what's interesting in SharePoint, though, is you need to take the sitemap and sanity check that on top of a logical architecture. So a logical architecture is closely related to the IA, wherein the IA is actually your sort of theoretical organization of your content. And then your logical design is what you have to do in, let's say, SharePoint or Office 365 to implement that. And you have to respect organizational boundaries. So how many people are on premises right now, SharePoint? And then put your hand down. How about Office 365? Okay, so it's close to half and half right now. Now, of those of you who have an on-premises environment, how many of you have multiple web applications? Okay, stop doing that. I know it's too late, but stop anyway. And the reason you want to stop is, number one, you don't need multiple web apps. All that TechNet stuff you read was a complete lie. It's true, complete lie. But I didn't write it, so I can say that. So, the reason you don't need multiple web apps is Microsoft only uses one, and they host multiple tenants on one farm with one web app, effectively. So one of the things you want to do is you'll notice that my little design here, and it's probably hard to see, but on the bottom I have the combination of a site architecture that's mapped to my physical constraints within SharePoint. For example, I have 3 web applications. I am separating it into my intranet content, my sites, for example, and my team sites. This is actually directly from TechNet, okay? Hopefully this isn't today's TechNet. I think that this page was killed before I took a picture and stole it. But you want to actually get to one web app. And the reason you want to do that is that you're not going to have the luxury, if you were to move to the cloud, for example, to be able to span multiple web applications at all, right? You're going to be tied to a given tenant, for example. So your boundary limitation becomes the site collection boundary, as opposed to anything larger than that. So your site collection boundary is what you need to start thinking about, and it's probably what you thought about 99% of the time anyway from a logical architecture perspective. But that means that if we have, 50 million documents that we want to store and we want them all to live together, we might need to rethink that because we don't necessarily want to put those all into one library, for example. We might want to split that up. Or we might want to partition that library in an effective way. You want to make sure you're ready for the cloud, even if you don't think you're going to the cloud anytime soon, right? You want to get used to a single web app. You want to make sure that you're categorizing your content by workload in a smart way. Like I said, intranet versus team sites, et cetera. And then in a hybrid scenario, you might do something like move your team sites in your OneDrive, right? OneDrive is effectively a replacement for my sites. And you want, let's say you move those to the cloud while your intranet is still on premises because you have full trust code there. And that's a reasonable scenario, but now your physical limitation is you have some stuff on premises, some stuff in the cloud. It's almost like we put a wall between the two halves of the store. Now, we still have one person that wants content across both sides of the store. How do we make that easy for them? Right? And using search that goes across both those platforms is a good way. Redirecting them through a menu is a smart way. It's almost like this convention center. Has anybody noticed that it's actually like 3 different buildings and we have to go through walkways and all these crazy things? The idea is we're trying to take multiple parts and make them feel like one whole to the user, and that's what we're going to have to do, right, given these constraints. So what about page architecture? Not just site architecture, but going to the page itself. And again, we're thinking about an aisle in the grocery store, if you will. And you want to use something, any kind of mock-up tool you like, but you want to think about how you're placing content on the page, right? And for publishing content, it's very useful to think about how you're laying out the content, but also how it maps to the underlying data. So, how it's physically represented on the screen is separate from how it's actually stored within SharePoint, for example. So you might have something like the author that's not actually showing up on the page, but that's part of the content type under the covers, right? But you want to think about from a page layout perspective. Now, anybody notice something here that is not in compliance with Office 365? Anybody want to tell me? So in this example, I'm referring to masterpage.master, which is my custom master page. How many people use custom master pages today? Okay, stop doing that too. And the reason I say that is that in Office 365, again, you want to be ready for the cloud, you're going to want to change that approach. You do not want to do custom master pages in Office 365. Instead, you want to do custom CSS that can let you do most of what you need to do, and then refer to that custom CSS from the out-of-the-box master. And so that's a big deal. Now, in information architecture, we're talking mostly about how we're organizing our content and how we're organizing the page and less about the branding, but sometimes the master page is including things like controls that help us through menus and content and things like that, so it is relevant to us. You also have different page types in publishing content, right? You have typically the home page, you have summary roll-ups, and in SharePoint you can do roll-ups in a couple of different ways. Within the context of a site collection, you can use the content query web part, which allows you to real time, and when I say real time, meaning the data is current, aggregate information within a site collection. And then you have the content search web part, which allows you to aggregate content across site collections. And it's not as real time because it's relying on the last refresh of the search index, but those two are 2 great ways to roll up information depending on your need, right? And then there's detail pages, and this is kind of the page I showed you last time, which is, how do we lay out content on the page? And then we want to get into how do you map that to the templates that are already in SharePoint. So for example, a publishing site has publishing templates that you can customize, which is nice, right? The problem is How many people use custom site templates and then save those templates and then you make new sites out of those templates? Okay, stop doing that too. Okay, so there's 3 things I don't want you to do anymore, right? Multiple web apps, custom master pages, and custom site templates. So instead, I want you to do client-side scripting. I want you to go to a site, rearrange it all you want, right? And then in the patterns and practices site, there's a way to kind of suck that XML off the page and then feed that into a client-side JavaScript set of code that will actually provision your next site based on that site. And the reason you want to do that is with constant refreshes, whether you're on premises or not, cloud more likely than not, underlying changes won't be reflected in your pages and you'll go out of compliance if you're not careful, right? So you want to make sure you're following these rules. Even if you're on premises today and don't think you're going to go to the cloud, Microsoft is going to come down and enforce those in the near future. All right, what about your navigation taxonomy? Well, let's go back to our grocery store for a minute. So let's say we've actually laid out what aisles things are in, because we did a card sorting exercise and people think that soup and crackers should go together, for example, right? But we probably want to think about how people are navigating our store or navigating our site. And we want to do tests and iterate. One of the things you'll find with information architecture is that you probably won't get it right the first time. You'll get it close, and then you'll want to iterate. And you'll want to iterate based on real-world feedback from clients, which are your users, right? Your client base is your users telling you, giving you feedback. So in SharePoint, we have a bunch of navigational concepts. We have things like local navigation, global navigation, breadcrumb, which in SharePoint, there's really no good full breadcrumb. You have to implement that yourself, really. There's physical constraints like the Office 365 bar, which you should never customize. That changes frequently as well, so you want to kind of stay away from that. But there are ways to customize, and I'm not going to go into the specific customization scenarios because there's a ton of sessions here at the conference. I want to go more into how this relates to information architecture and why that matters. So what about branding? So branding is not IA, and IA is not branding, right? They're not the same thing. In fact, branding really isn't even part of IA per se. But you want to determine when you create your site, let's say it's an intranet site, what the requirements will be that will influence branding. So for example, are there going to be logos and colors and headers and all these different things? And if so, you want to understand the limitations of the platform. So for example, like I mentioned, no custom master pages, you want to actually say, listen, can I do what I want to do with CSS? Okay, so let's take these principles and apply it to document content, and then we'll do some demos and things like that, right? So that we get into and apply this stuff a little bit more. So document content, this is what my desk looks like at work. And what I want to do is put it all in SharePoint and have it resemble something like that, right? That's our goal. Again, just like the forks are neatly organized in the drawer, the soup's neatly organized on the shelf, we want to neatly organize our document content. So how do we do that? So how many people have done this, which is set up SharePoint just like a file share, which is you just create a bunch of folders and then everybody's just using SharePoint instead of a file share? How many people have done that? Okay. The issue with this is it's actually very familiar to people because they're used to folders, for example. Folders are actually pretty useful, or can be. But there's a lot of clicking, there's a lot of hidden content, there's only one dimension for figuring out what's going on. You can't sort things virtually, right? There's a lot of physical constraints, even though it's not physical like I can touch it. It's physical as in folders are a container that it doesn't have a lot of flexibility. And there's no metadata, there's no navigation, there's no search, inherently speaking. And this is actually great for contributors because let's say I have a document that's a legal document for Microsoft. I could stick it into the Microsoft folder, click down to the legal folder, and I just shove it in there, and I'm like, all right, I called it a day. That was easy, right? But then you go to find that content later, and it's a nightmare. All right, so how many people set up SharePoint this way, which is metadata instead of folders? Okay. And that's because everybody says that's what you're supposed to do? Is that why you did it? Yeah. Okay, don't do what you're told. Okay. And I'll get to that. Don't freak out too much. So the woman in the front row just had a stroke. I didn't mean to do that. So I'm just giving you the different options here. So the second option is, okay, we're going to forget folders, just throw those out the window completely. It's a brave new world, right? We're going from file shares to SharePoint. So guess what we're going to do? We're going to throw out those folders. We're going to do things like create columns. We're going to make it easier for multi-dimensional sorting and all the good stuff that columns provide, right? The issue, though, is that with metadata instead of folders, it's not as familiar to users. People are just used to folders. We have to add metadata, right? And so if people aren't used to doing that and they get lazy, they either skip it or just pick some random thing, and it's actually worse than if it had nothing sometimes. There's no sort of drag and drop capability that's really great because you still have to go in and tag it later. Offline with OneDrive, there's some challenges there that I'll go into. But it's actually fantastic for consumers, right? Because I can go in and then say, wait, there's 1 million documents in this library. Let's filter by Microsoft or Blue Yonder Airlines or whatever my filter is, and then I get the stuff instantaneously. It actually helps search as well. Okay, so what should we do? Well, treating your content contributors differently from your consumers is helpful because, again, let me switch over to a demo real quick. Okay, you guys can see this, right? So I have a lovely document library with some lovely columns here, so I'm following all the rules. I upload a document, I'm asked for some metadata, and I put it in. I can do sorting. It's all good stuff, right? This is actually a really good scenario, but what if I, for example, want to take this offline? What's going to happen? I'm actually going to lose all of my tagging, and I have one big set of files. What if I'm not trained well on how I should tag it? Well, I might make a mess of the folder, right? So there's some potential challenges here, but it's a good set of practices. So I actually prefer to treat your content contributors differently than your consumers a little bit and give them different views. Because if you'll notice in the last example, we had columns like I showed you, but you force people to tag things, which is good if they're trained and they're going to be consistent about doing it and you're enforcing their policies, right? But I actually prefer to do the following when feasible, which is design your columns in your document libraries. So for example, in this case, we want to capture 3 things. We want to capture, let's say, the customer name for these documents, what type of document it is. Let's say it's a legal doc or a marketing doc. And then the business unit for this, because sometimes, our controller says, hey, can you give me all the legal contracts for all the airlines we work with? Right? It seems like a reasonable request, and they can do that because we're tagging the documents properly. The thing I like to do is actually take this one step further and actually create folders that mirror some of these columns. So for example, I might say, you know what, I'm still going to create one level of folders, and I'll show you why in a second. So the first reaction I might get is, wait a minute, you want me to create folders? Right? I was told to avoid doing that. And my response is sometimes. So don't always create folders, but sometimes create folders. Right? So 3 valid reasons is you're creating partitioning for some valid reason. In a document library, there are valid reasons for creating partitioning. One big one is if you have a ton of content, partitioning via folders, for example, in a library helps scale, and it helps the underlying database. But a more obvious one is for security reasons. So let's say I have one library, and I have contracts in there, but I have 2 levels of permissioning, right? I have contracts under $100,000 and contracts over $100,000, and I have a different set of people who can view those. Well, it would be silly for me to put those into, different site collections or different libraries. It just makes sense for all the contracts to live together. But if I create 2 folders, right? One called under 100,000 and one called 100,000 and over, and I set permissions on that folder, then I'm done. So what I'm doing is I'm actually creating an information architecture decision, applied information architecture is the word I like to use, right? Where we've made a decision to separate those logically, let's say on paper, and then when we go to implement that in SharePoint, we're doing it via a mechanism where we're creating a folder, which is a physical structure with properties on that that'll do that for us. And then what we get is, I go to the document library, I'm of one permission, I see 20 legal docs, I'm of the other, I see 10. Right? SharePoint takes care of all the work for me, and it's not by obscurity either. I'm not creating a view that just hides them artificially. I'm actually creating real security that will never let me see them ever, and they won't show up in search, etc. So security is actually a really good reason to create a folder when implementing my IA, right? Another one is location-based metadata defaults. So how many people use this feature? All right, so maybe 6 of you. How many people have never heard of this feature at all? Okay, so the idea of this feature is, let's say I'm going to put content into a library and I want to enforce tagging, let's say, so that I get good labeling, if you will, right? If you think about, again, our metaphor, I'm going to tell people which aisle to go to, but I still want them to put labels on the cans, so to speak, so that they're not just empty, you know, label-less cans on the right shelf, right? That doesn't, it only helps me halfway. It gets me close to the content, but doesn't get me to the right content exactly. So location-based metadata defaults do the following for me. They allow me to do this, which is, given a container, whether it's a library or a folder, I can say when somebody puts content in here, automatically tag it in SharePoint with these metadata values. So let's say we have our 3 columns, right? If we go back to our example, and we have, you know, our customer, our doc type, and our business unit, notice that I've actually separated the experience. I actually have 2 views here that I've created. I've created a documents view, which is my default view, and that is an unfoldered view. So I go into SharePoint and I check the box or uncheck the box that says, you know, I say ignore folders effectively, right? But notice there's actually a folders view, which reveals the fact that I actually have folders present in this document library. And the reason I have folders present is I'm using all of the good reasons for folders all at once. Number one, I plan to have 1 million documents in this library, so I want there to be good, solid partitioning. Folders help me there. I also want different levels of security depending on what type of document it is. Legal document has a little more security than other documents. So notice within my each customer, I have a legal document folder. Now I'm only going 2 deep. I don't want to go more than 2 deep, probably ever if I can help it, because what that's going to do is it's going to create the same mess that I had in the file shares, and I don't want that to happen. But my folders actually correspond to my metadata columns here. And the reason they correspond is that I can do some interesting things with my number 2 feature, which is this location-based metadata defaults. And what that allows me to do then is say that if I'm in the Blue Yonder Airlines folder, and in fact, if I'm in the legal subfolder, if anybody puts a document in there, automatically tag that with it's an airline, right? Because I already know that contextually. It's the Blue Yonder company, and it's a legal document. So I can infer those things based on the information. So think of if you're a grocery store clerk, and there's a specific shelf in the soup aisle, okay? And there's a place where Campbell's chicken soup's supposed to go, because there's a little tag on the shelf. And you had blank cans with no labels on them. And you put them on the shelf, and magically when you put them on the shelf, a label appeared, exactly how you want it. So that if you took that can now and threw it in the bread aisle, and someone found it there, they'd still know it's chicken soup because it's properly labeled, right? It doesn't kind of matter where it is. In fact, grocery stores do this all the time. They have chocolate bars in the candy aisle and with the marshmallows and on an end cap and at the checkout counter, right? It could be in 4 different places. Who cares where it is? As long as it's labeled properly and it makes logical sense, that works. So the location-based metadata default feature in SharePoint allows me to effectively take an unlabeled piece of content, put it in the right place, and SharePoint labels it for me on my behalf. And that can come in useful later, again, when I find myself wanting to find something via that label being a metadata column, for example. The third reason you might want to do this is, imagine I have this library again. So let's go back to this one. Now imagine I had no folders at all, and I had 1 million documents in here. And then I want to take this offline. First of all, never do that, because OneDrive for Business will not handle 1 million documents. Your computer catches on fire, and like a lot of bad things happen, so don't do that. But let's say you have 100 documents, and you can reliably say, I could take these offline, I'm going to use these a lot, and I want to take these into a OneDrive for Business sort of synced share, or offline folder. The problem, though, is that none of my metadata tags follow me, right? What does OneDrive use? It uses the classic folder structure. So now I'm actually stuck where online, I actually want these columns, and offline, I don't want any columns, I want folders. So now I have this thing where folders work great offline and columns work great online. Now I'm stuck. So this hybrid approach allows you to effectively get the best of both worlds. I want to talk about that a little bit more and do a demo in a second. So essentially what we're doing is saying, listen, with a combination of, well, let's actually do the demo now because I think it'll make more sense. Let's do that, shall we? You guys have been sitting through too many slides. Come on. Oh, there it is. All right, you guys can see my library, right? All right, so let's say I take this offline. So I hit the sync button. This allows me to take this offline into OneDrive for Business. And the reason users like this is they're used to going over and going to their file share, and they're used to going in here and you go through all the files and blah, 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 right? So that's why they like things like Dropbox. How many people actually use Dropbox in your organization? So one of the things that Microsoft has is OneDrive for Business, which actually manifests itself in multiple ways, right? Now, notice I go into Dropbox and I can do things like, go into different folders and all that stuff. It's the paradigm I'm used to using, and it's fast because it's synced offline. What if I want to do the same thing with my SharePoint documents? Well, I can go into either OneDrive, which actually shows me my site library. Okay, so that's really what the personal OneDrive for Business. So there's personal OneDrive, which has nothing to do with anything, right? That's the consumer thing. There's OneDrive for Business, which actually allows me to look at my company's SharePoint my site documents, which either on premises is my site or in the cloud with Office 365 is my OneDrive for Business docs, which really is a manifestation of my site under the covers. So that's what it morphs into. Or I can actually go into this thing called SharePoint. So I don't know if you can read that on the left here. It says SharePoint. What this is going to contain is all the libraries that I've synced offline using that sync button. So notice I go over here, and when I hit this sync button here, it actually shows up on this list. So you'll notice I've actually already synced to this, and offline, it's actually very easy for me to say, you know what, I want the legal docs under Blue Yonder Airlines, and there they are, right? Even though my metadata doesn't do me any good, but online I want that because I want sorting, I want multi-dimensional filtering, I want search to work. But then there's a neat trick we can do where if we do things like, all right, let's bring this up. Actually, let me full screen this. Let me actually set some default metadata properties like I mentioned before. So how do I do that? Well, if I go to Library, I go to the Library settings, and I go into column default value settings, right? One of the things I can do is, given my folder structure, which SharePoint shows to me, I could say, you know what, for Blue Yonder Airlines Legal, let's go in here and say, anytime someone puts something in there, make the customer Blue Yonder Airlines. Make the doc type legal, make the business unit airline. And I just set this up once. Right? Only once ever. And it's like setting up the magic buttons on the soup shelf. Now, anytime anybody stocks this shelf, the labels automatically appear, right? So then I can do fun things like, now that I have these docs offline, what's interesting is I can contribute offline. So for example, let's say I'm not even connected to the internet. Okay, actually, let's do this. So let's pull the plug. So this is my internet cable. So now I'm offline. Okay, so if I go here, and I try to refresh this page. Well, fine, I'll turn my Wi-Fi off. This guy doesn't believe me. Sheesh. All right, so I'm unable to connect. You happy my Wi-Fi's off? Hold on, ready? Let me do that again just so he sees it. Ready? Airplane mode, on. There you go, all right. Okay, this guy's a tricky one. I'm going to keep my eye on him. All right, so let's say I'm on the plane, and I want to work with these documents. Well, the nice thing is in OneDrive for Business, I'm actually working with these offline. So let's actually go over here and do something like, I don't know, let's create a new doc. So let's go over here and create let's create a Word doc here. And let's create AAA Blue Yonder, let's say, I don't know, Yonder Ignite. So we know what it is. And then I'll do my favorite demo trick of all time, which is equals lorem. And then that creates some bogus Latin. Okay, so now I have my doc. So let's say I'm working on the plane offline. What I could do is I could just go over to Blue Yonder Airlines, drag this into legal, right? And now I close this down and I go watch my video or something, right? So that was the easiest contribution to SharePoint I've ever made in my life. I was offline. All I did was drag it and drop it into some folder. And now when I connect back up online, and we'll give it a second because it's probably going to take a second. And no, I'm not going to turn my Wi-Fi back on just to show you that was actually my connection. But let's refresh this puppy. All right, there we are. So now we're back to my site. So let's actually go back to the actual site itself, which is right about here. All right, so what's interesting is I have this new document called AAA Blue Yonder Ignite, and it's already tagged for me, Blue Yonder Airlines. It's a legal doc, and it's in the airlines business unit. So now if I do a filter, or I go over here and I say, you know what, I only want Blue Yonder Airlines, right? I can do interesting things, and even if I have 1 million documents in there, it'll sort it and do all the fun stuff that metadata does for me. So what's interesting is that given your particular scenario, columns are useful to define, right, because they provide obvious benefits. But the downside is that users have to explicitly provide the values to them. So what's interesting is you can actually use folders for very specific scenarios like we went over, right? Security and partitioning, default metadata, and then the offline scenario to provide you actually with context, because the only context I get offline is actually through that folder structure, as you saw, right? And it would work the same way. If I contributed online, it would show up offline because it's syncing and all that stuff. All right. So what's interesting is that I'm actually doing a couple things here, too. I'm actually providing multiple views, and I showed this a second ago, but let me show it again, where I have my regular view is hiding folders because my consumers kind of don't really care about folders anymore. They're clunky. They obfuscate what I can't and can't see. They limit me to one dimension, right? What I really want is to be able to sort and filter by all these columns. But my contributors, actually, it makes it much easier for them to contribute when I give them a foldered view. And that's so that, let's say I'm online, I'm not doing my offline scenario, but I'm online, and I go to Blue Yonder, Legal, and then I do a drag and drop here, right, which I could do. I could do this. Where'd my document go? I guess I drag and dropped it, so it's gone. But let's say I add a new one, and let's do one more. Let's do BBB, Blue Yonder, Ignite. Let's make sure it has stuff in it. Okay, and then if I drag and drop this online, so notice I'm in the browser. One of the cool features of SharePoint 2013 and Office 365 is I can do dragging and dropping in the browser, and that still will uphold my metadata, automatic tagging, all that stuff. Again, if I go back to the regular view, notice that's tagged, right? The second one down, it's tagged with all the right stuff, right? And what that allows me to do is actually use that combination of folders and metadata sort of in sync. Now, your mileage may vary, is my disclaimer, right? You're not going to do this in every scenario, and it doesn't necessarily apply to all your publishing content or all your document library content, but it actually can come in handy in both scenarios. Because again, you want to consider the container in which things live, the label for which things have interesting metadata applied to it, and then how you're going to find it, either through navigation or through search. And with those 4 elements, you're going to do a pretty good job. And I would say there's scenarios where you need a professional information architect to come help you facilitate that, and other scenarios where something like this you can probably cobble together yourself because there's enough context that you're not making it overly complex, and you can handle that. So I would say keep an eye on that scenario. So let's actually go back to, we got about 20 minutes left. All right. So the playbook is, use folders and default properties together. A contribution and offline works well that way in some scenarios. Again, there are limitations that I'll talk about with OneDrive for Business that you don't want to get yourself into too much hurt, world, or danger. Consumption, browsing, and navigation. You want different views. You want to configure nav. Maybe use offline if it's relevant. We didn't talk that much about search, but do things like encourage good titles, right? Interestingly enough, it's the simplest thing in the world. Does everybody know the difference between a file name and a title? Who does not? Everybody thinks they're exactly the same thing, right? Oh, God. Okay, let's do another demo that I wasn't planning on doing, but I have to as a public service announcement. So I'm going off script now, so my hands will never leave my wrists. Let's see what happens. So let's say I want to find a file. Let's have fun with this, actually. Let's go in. And let's pretend instead of a new document, I actually borrowed this document from somebody else. And here's what typically happens. So let's go in and actually change the title to Death Star Plans. Okay. So let's pretend I used to work for the Empire, right? Star Wars movie's coming out. Yesterday was, right, May the 4th be with you and all that, so I have to stay on topic. And today is Revenge of the 5th, right? Sorry, I know. Okay. So then let's actually change this document. Let's rename this to CCC, Blue Yonder Ignite, Ignote, whatever. And then let's say we put it in the right place. Let's say we put it into here. So again, it'll all be tagged correctly. And I have to give it a minute, but notice if I search for let's see, Ignote, I'm not going to get anything. You know what? Crawl has to run. Let's give it a few minutes and we'll come back to the demo. But essentially, what can happen is that SharePoint sometimes isn't smart enough or is doing what it's told and takes the title property, which is buried in the innards of the document, and shows you that in search results. And the problem with that is that if users aren't correcting the title property that they don't even know about that's buried in the document, sometimes in search results you won't even know you got the right document. Right, so I'll set up that and we'll see if it crawls that in a second. All right, so let's keep going and I'll come back to the demo. So you also want to map your crawled properties, right? There's going to be properties that are inherent in the doc. You want to map those into ones that are consumable by the user. We didn't get into search too deeply. And then you want to align your taxonomy. So what do I mean by that? Well, earlier we talked about taxonomy, which is all the different ways you can do categorization and an organization system for your stuff. Well, in SharePoint, you can configure a whole bunch of different things which align with how you actually do categorization, right? So for example, you know, there's things like folders and metadata, but there's all kinds of other stuff that I'll get to in a second. So you want to fix contribution, we talked about that. Fix browsing and navigation. We talked about some search things. Hold on, before I get too far, let's give the book away, because I do not want to forget about that. So, okay, so here's a question I sometimes ask, and it's a little obscure, but raise your hand and I'll give you the book if you get the right answer. What is the name of the magazine that features Goofus and Gallant? Anybody raise their hand? That hand went up right there with a hat. Or next to the hat, excuse me. The woman right there. Yes, you. Highlights, okay, you win the book. So you can come get it after, how's that? All right, wanted to make sure we gave away the book. There is a whopping 3 more available at the bookstore today that we're giving away. But they have a whole bunch at the bookstore. If you're looking to lug another 20 pounds home with you, you can buy one there. So, how many people actually already own the purple book, as it's called? About 3 of you. Thank you. That's my kids' college fund right there, 3 books. Actually, if I leave in a hurry, my wife's pregnant, so I should have mentioned that earlier. Okay. So what are the 7 things I talked about earlier? Well, the 7 things in particular are, okay, so let's say, for example, we want to make sure we're capturing the client that we're working with, and we want to make sure we're tagging any piece of content, whether it's a news article, a document, a contract, whatever, with that client information. Guess what? The IA part is almost easy, right? We go in and say, okay, here's how we're going to tag the doc. Here's what the soup label looks like, so to speak. Here's the container it's going to go in, which is this site collection. Here's how we're going to organize the menus. But guess what? Configuring all that in SharePoint is a bit of a nightmare because SharePoint actually has independent things that don't tie together. For example, I can independently go create a site column called company name, and I'm done. But that doesn't mean I have consistent company names in my term store. That's yet another place to configure that aligns to that, but it's separate, right? And then I have folders. Folders are another way to containerize, or via a container, essentially indicate that I have a legal document for company X, right? It's just a different way to do the same thing, although we just saw that a hybrid approach sometimes works pretty well. Another one is searching for things. I need to go in and actually configure manage properties. And then if I want to do things like best bets or filtered navigation and all these different things, right, I actually need to configure keywords that allow me to do that there in addition to manage properties. And then global nav on the top. Let's say I want a direct link to the latest article or a page that's focused on Microsoft News, and Microsoft's one of my clients. I have to configure another thing there. And then maybe I have local nav, which allows me to do things like filter. For example, I don't know if you noticed in my demo, but I actually had these key filters over here. So what I did is I said, listen, I want you to index my content on some of those columns, and I'm actually going to allow the user to go over here and actually use some of this local navigation for filtering purposes. So in SharePoint, even if you align what you know you want to do on pen and paper with your information architecture process, by the time you map it to SharePoint, you want to make sure you're doing all these different things in sync, in concert. And there's no necessarily one place in SharePoint you can do that. All right, so let me try that search demo real quick to see if I can prove the point. If not, then we'll do it next time. How's that sound? So let's try it real quick. So if I go into here and I do a search for, let's say, ignore, because I spelled it wrong. Notice what it says. What does my search result say? Death Star plans. So what's interesting is that that poor sap of a user, okay, got a document from Bob, took Bob's document, made some changes, uploaded saved it with a new title, which was perfectly appropriate. It was called blah, Blue Yonder Ignote, blah, 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 right? Let's say that was the right spelling. And then uploaded that to SharePoint. And then they go to search on it, and what do they search on? The right thing, Ignote. And that's just my misspelling, by the way. That's what I should have found that document. Guess what I didn't find? I didn't find that document, at least as far as that user's concerned. They found a different document. They look at this and they go, wow, SharePoint's search is really awful, isn't it? That's what the users would say, because they say, I just uploaded the document 10 minutes ago and I can't find it, right? But what SharePoint's doing is, under the covers, it found this title property, which it thinks is correct, and you don't even realize exists. And that's what it's showing to you in search results. And by the way, this is the latest build of Office 365. This is not, but SharePoint is broken, but it's not broken, meaning this is just, SharePoint's just reflecting what the user did, but the user didn't realize they did it. So when you're thinking about information architecture, and we thought about which aisle does it go in, right? Which shelf does it go on? What label should we have on the can, right? Which is essentially site architecture, page architecture, and then tagging or columns. And then we had a fourth one. What was the fourth one? I should have given away the book because you guys weren't paying attention on that question. Teleporting, right? That was the fourth one, which is search, right? In the store, we'd have to teleport to aisle 7. In SharePoint, we have search. That'll magically take us to the content, except this is what happens, which is we reliably, and by the way, here's one way to see this another way, which is if I go to the actual document library, which is here. What was it called again? It was, thank you, CCC. Someone's paying attention. I should have given you the book. Maybe I'll give you one at the book signing. So there it is, CCC by Ignote. What don't we have? We don't have the title here. So one of the things we can do, just to jar the user's memory a little bit, is modify the view. And this is actually an interesting recommendation that I think you guys should follow, especially with a content contributor, is add the title to the default view. And what happens is it makes that user think about the title because it's staring them in the face. And if you look, my CCC by Ignite, there's the title. It's called Death Star Plans. And what's interesting is SharePoint search is using the title property, not the file name, when it's showing us the search results. So it's confusing the crap out of the user because they don't even know that title exists. They didn't type in Death Star Plans. They just borrowed somebody else's document that, had that in there. Does that make sense? This happens all the time. By the way, this is the #1 reason why you think search doesn't work. It actually works really well, and you guys are just screwing it up. Sorry. I'm going to get Rotten Tomatoes thrown at me by saying that. But you understand why. And here's the thing. If I go over here and I type in, how did I misspell it? Ignote? Watch this. This is even more confusing. The local search within the document library actually works because the local search is using the file name, and the global search service application is actually using the title property. So not only are we confusing users, we're confusing them extra, just for fun. Okay. So just make a mental note of that title thing because it's really important, even in the latest and greatest build of SharePoint, especially in the latest and greatest build of SharePoint. So I don't know if you noticed, but we didn't go into content types, document sets, content organizer. The funny thing is when I talk to someone about IA and then applying that to SharePoint, the first thing they ask me is, okay, content types, let's start doing content types. And it's like, whoa, slow down here. Prove to me that in the example we just did, that will work without a content type, and then I'll let you turn that into a content type. Because don't get more complex than you need to right off the bat. If you're telling me you need to use that content, the fact that we want to capture company name or document type in everything across the company, great. Now I think we have a valid use case for creating a new document content type. We're not going to modify the out-of-the-box one. We're called document, right? We're going to make a new one called, let's say, Contoso documents or whatever, or Contoso document, which is actually a content type that captures that, and then we can use that. But let's prove it in our IA first on paper through an exercise like a silverware or a movie or a Netflix, or make sure users understand what they're signing up for with regard to categorization and what that means. Then do it in SharePoint in a manner that I did, and then apply it to content types. Don't jump to content types, especially you technical developer types. I know you're in here, because I'm one of those people that had to break that habit. So what did I say? Never modify the content type at the root, create a company doc, and then from there you can do things like derive, right? And there's inheritance. You map those to your term store. I'm not going to go into this. There's about 10 other sessions on this stuff. But we want to talk about things like where do files go, for example. And this is another container thing, right? Philosophically, if you put things into your My area, that's typically your OneDrive for Business. That's kind of like your My site, right? Not a lot of governance in there. Who cares if it's one level deep with no tagging and people do crazy things? They're the only ones who have to find it later. And that's the important part. Imagine a grocery store, right? In the soup aisle, we want the soup to be pristine, and we want the aisle 12 sign to be really well lit and everything, because random people off the street have to find soup quickly, right? But if you go up to the manager's desk, above the courtesy booth or whatever it is, and there's like paper scattered all over the manager's desk, who cares if that's not that well organized? Do you know why? Because that manager's the only one that uses that desk, and he can find everything just fine. So that's analogous to the My work files, essentially. But then as you move up to team sites, corporate documents, things like that, you want it more organized and more highly governed. Then you want to think about life cycle, right? How do these things get disposed? I'm going to refer you to a session tomorrow. If you're concerned at all about things like role-based access to SharePoint or e-discovery or content auditing or anything like that related to the content that you're putting in SharePoint, there's a session tomorrow that you should go to that Chris Bortlick's doing. So just refer you to that session. Another couple things, there are limitations on OneDrive for Business, 20,000 items max, which is why I said don't try to sync offline something with 1 million documents. You'll hurt really bad. It won't be a fun experience. Just remember the difference between a OneDrive and your company, et cetera, like I mentioned. And there's a mobile app for it, so it's super handy. So I would encourage, in limited usage, it's super handy as an offline experience for SharePoint content. So just to recap, we're trying to take our messy stuff, put it through our 4-step process, and make sure we have key things, right? A logical location for where things go, proper labeling, and then some way to get to it, either via navigation or search. And when in doubt, go back to the grocery store analogy, because it actually works pretty well. And then you have a nice, pristine, organized, for example, in this case, a drawer, right? I want you to go to this site on TechNet. There's a really good article about information management with respect to 2013. There's also a great IA 101 site that talks about a lot of this stuff without respect to SharePoint, but it's useful. And then the Norman Group report, the Nielsen-Norman Group report, is good because it shows successful intranets and why they're organized the way they are and why they're successful because of that organization. So that's all I have, and thank you for coming.